Welcome to the Psychologym podcast, a platform where we discuss the mental, physical, and emotional health of your world. Welcome to where mind meets body. With your host, Kristen McAdams.
Welcome to the Psychologym podcast, y'all. I'm your host, Kristen McAdams. If you are having a mental health emergency, please dial 911 or the suicide prevention hotline 988. We are here to have constructive conversations. We are not here to give you professional medical advice. Please go seek a medical professional. It's a podcast. That being said, also, if you're a client of mine and you don't like what you hear, feel free to bring it up in session or feel free to ask for a referral. That being said, I'm in the studio today with Mike Bledsoe. I'm very excited to have him here. I feel like there should have been an applause break there. Like, Mike Bledsoe, and then just applause should have been what happened. I met Mike at the How Do You Health Fest put on by the MSW Lounge here in Austin, Texas. I will drop a link to the MSW Lounge in the YouTube episode description and the Spotify episode description if you want to check them out. And I think the link has like 10%, 20% off, something fancy like that. So feel free to check that out. But I saw Mike speaking at the event and his talk was absolutely mind-blowing, phenomenal. I was so blown away by the fact that he was presenting such clear, concise, and also bold information. And a lot of what he's going to talk about today is around integral theory and integral psychology, which is part of the talk that he gave. But I'll let him introduce himself. So go ahead. Tell the people who you are.
It felt like such a serious introduction. I'm like, oh no.
I know, and now you got to put the real thought in. Okay,
oh shit!
Reevaluate what I was going to say.
I got to tell them who I am now. People hate talking about themselves. Are you one of those people that hates talking about themselves?
I don't know where to start a lot of times. I don't know where to start. Well, I'll start here because you mentioned that I had some bold ideas.
That
I was presenting, and it's funny because I have a few friends that we all share this one thing, this one attribute in our life, and that is that we were all homeschooled all the way through. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a nerdy homeschool kid, right? Yep. And so, and it's funny. I went to a retreat about 2 months ago where we were tinkering with our consciousness. Basically, It was a whole week of just heavy duty coaching.
Yeah.
And she was like, "See, he's a little different." Because he wasn't indoctrinated. He didn't have 12 years of indoctrination. That's why he's going to that's why he's going to think differently. And my two friends, Ben Greenfield and Jesse Elder, are two guys I know that are, successful in the coaching world.
Yeah.
And when the three of us have been in the same room a couple of times and it's just the three of us and everyone else just kind of gets quiet and we're like, it's like finally someone who gets me.
Yeah.
And I put it together recently. I was like, oh, we were just all homeschooled.
Because I imagine you can talk about the same ideas in a very different way with a very different perspective, and that the conditioning is not only like academic but also social, and so people get that neuro-linguistic programming in their minds, and they don't realize that they're only talking about things in one way. Right.
Well, there's I have a friend. I don't know, you probably have met him, Ani Mannion.
Yes.
He lives here in town, and he grew up knowing 3 languages. Mm-hmm. And that's another way of we're programmed through language.
Yes.
Like the mind is. And you got a guy here who knows 3 languages that are very different from each other. It's not like there was like Portuguese and Spanish. It was, Indian, English, and something else. And the way that his mind works is obviously different than somebody who only knows English.
Yeah.
And so there are these little things that I think most people aren't aware of that can make a huge difference in how someone perceives the world and how they're thinking about things.
How do you find that being homeschooled helped you socialize or not? Do you socialize differently, do you think?
Man, everybody in my I have 4 younger siblings. 4 of us are hypersocial.
Okay.
And
you crave it, want it, extroverted, want to be around it?
I don't know if I necessarily want to be around it. I'm good at it.
Okay.
And so...
Good distinction.
Yeah. I do thrive in that environment. If you ask my fiance, she was like, yeah, just turn him loose in a party, and I'll have to find him 3 hours later. I like to tell stories. I like to do all that. The socializing I got was I wasn't interacting with kids my own age. I was either interacting with people who were older, so I had tutors who were older. I was also interacting with other homeschool kids like once a week for an hour if we were learning Latin together. Like I took a Latin class with 4 other guys. Yeah. And so we're all living a similar lifestyle, but only meeting for a small period of time. And so like I'm being surrounded by a lot of people who are older than me, and then going to work with my dad in construction. Yeah. So like I'm interacting with a lot of people who are older, and I'm also helping taking care of people who are younger. But I'm not necessarily. The only time I was interacting with people who would be considered peers was like a few hours here and there during the week for these tutoring lessons. And then there was the weekend we'd go to church. So church was, I'd have this 3 hour, we were there from 9 to noon, and I was like hanging out, and then we'd all go to lunch afterwards. That was like my big social time. Yeah. So I went to 3 proms in my senior year of high school. When people were like worried, like, oh, what are you gonna do for so? I was like, oh, I somehow figured out how to be fairly popular while also not spending a lot of time with my peers.
Right. Yeah. That academic conditioning is such a huge thing for me. Like I talk about it a lot, and I never mean to like really hate on academia, but I think I wind up doing that because I went to lots of schools and got lots of degrees, and I learned more outside of academia than I ever did in it. And that conditioning, like I think specifically when it comes to like integral theory even, is that I went through 4 years. I took psychology in high school. I went through 4 years of undergrad. I took a year of a doctorate program. I got an associate's degree somewhere in there. I got like half of a business degree in there somewhere too. And then I got my master's. And through all of that schooling, integral theory never came up once. And here I am, like, I remember when you gave your talk, I just did a podcast. One of the podcast episodes that we just released was on the 4 pillars of mental health. And it talked about thinking about all of the things that impact mental health. And when I heard you give your talk, I was like, well, shit, somebody already did it. And I didn't know that somebody already did it. And I was like, well, now I'm behind the game again. But it's not discussed in school, integral theory. Like Ken Wilber, right? Is his name? Yeah. It never came up once in a book. Ever. So when you brought it up on stage, I was like,
he's too new.
He's
still alive. That's why no one's studying.
Well, and that's the
there's nothing studied in school because he's still alive.
Yeah. Yeah, you can still talk to him. Nobody likes that.
that could cause a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem with academia, right? One of my passions is the path to professionalism, and I know that you're familiar with this, and your fiance Ashley, right? I'm sure she's familiar with this as well. One of my passions is this path to professionalism, because academia is so slow to evolve, and it's so small-minded, and it's so compartmentalized. And it's like, specifically for mental health therapists, you get out. First of all, they tell you you're never going to do anything with a degree in psychology. Second of all, they tell you that you have to pick a theory. And then people drive themselves into like CBT or DBT or all these standard traditional talk therapies that are consistently proving that they're not helping people, right? You're introduced to like abnormal psych, which I think is now like normal society at this point. Like I don't even think it's like a thing anymore.
Yeah, they just keep on changing the rules.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They're like normalizing, the abnormal thing because they tried to lift the stigma, right? They tried to lift the stigma, and in doing so, we threw everything out the window.
Yeah, there's this brings up so much for me. But one thing is like, because of I think how I was educated, I'm much more likely to look for principles than methods, and people get stuck in the methods, and takes them forever to find the principles if they ever do.
Hence, like evidence-based. When they talk about evidence-based, it's all methods, right? It's all in the science,
right? And so I think like a Ken Wilber, if you start studying his stuff, it's all principle-based. Yeah, and so which makes it really, really useful if you can figure out how to apply it. So different people think in different ways. Like I'm very good at taking theories and figuring out my own application and testing, but I don't think many people are taught how to do that.
It's like critical thinking.
Yeah.
God forbid we do that. That really isn't something that is taught. You're taught what to think, not how to think. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. I mean, well, when we open up our phone, how many people check in with yourself right now? If you check your phone as the first thing you do in the day, you are being told what to think to start your day. So the same thing happens in early childhood development, right? The earlier you can make an impact on somebody in their development, the stronger that impact is going to be on the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. Well, we can also look at it as in the same thing happens in your day. The thing that happens first thing in the day is going to have a stronger impact on the rest of your day.
Right.
And so people are rolling over in bed, whipping out their phone, and Google or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter is telling them what to think about when they first get up. Mm-hmm. Now the rest of your day is set up based on what somebody outside of yourself wants you to think about.
No wonder everybody feels depressed and anxious, right? They feel like they're wrong, or they're doing it wrong, or they don't have what they need, or they aren't who they are supposed to be, right? And that does happen in early development as well, right? Like you're born with this temperament and this personality, but then you get conditioned through all these things based on your nervous system conditioning, and then your thoughts, values, and beliefs, mm-hmm. right? Which we can get a little bit more into that when we introduce the theory itself. But that's what I think society and mental health doesn't understand or doesn't want to look at, right? Because if we heal it, then we can't have that. We can't fix these problems. We can't have these solutions, right? But if you start to look at that, you challenge everything somebody thought they knew from day one, but then they also realize that they've been living misaligned, they're not aligned with themselves because mm-hmm. they were conditioned out of knowing who they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we forget who we are.
Yeah,
very quickly.
Yeah. Let's jump over to the threshold segment, and we'll introduce integral theory in a more formal way, and we'll talk about how it came into your life and how you came across it and how you use it.
Sounds good.
Go. Right, we're gonna move on to the threshold segment, not section, segment. Learn how to use my words as a podcaster. So I'd really like to hear how you came across integral theory, because I came across it through you. So I'd like to know where you came across it. Okay. And how do you implement it in the work that you do for starters?
I think this creates a good segue into something I wanted to say that occurred to me after the last segment. Is not I've learned things differently, mm-hmm. and so people that not all academia is bad. Mm-hmm. I think I have a bachelor's degree in exercise sports science. The best thing I got from that was surrounding myself with people who are also interested in that topic.
Yeah,
and
I always say that it's the networking is so underestimated. I realized that after I graduated was that I should have used my resources better, because mm-hmm. it really is about networking more than anything else. Mm-hmm. You learn the education piece later.
Yeah, I was in school and was involved with research with a guy named Dr. Andy Galpin, as an example, who now has just done a 6 episode series with Andrew Huberman.
Oh, cool.
And so he's I'm just
on fire, Huberman.
Yeah, he's on fire. Yeah. And it's these are the networking. If you go to an academic setting and you insert yourself and you identify who the best professors are, because mm-hmm. there were some professors I didn't care about, mm-hmm. and there were certain students and people who were a level or two above me. I hung out with them, mm-hmm. and that
from being homeschooled and hanging out with other people.
And I seek information. I seek education where other people are seeking pieces of paper. Yeah. So because you're taught when you're a kid, here's a piece of paper. You need to get this grade, get this diploma, whatever.
It'll magically give you all your hopes and dreams.
Yeah. So how I found integral theory was I actually found myself in the room with Ken Wilber.
Oh, wow.
So which is very difficult to do. But yeah, I was introduced to integral theory because I was at a business mastermind in Miami, Florida in 2013, or it was January 2014. And there's 150 entrepreneurs, a very eclectic group. One of these guys, his name is Mark Gaffney, and he's a rabbi. And he's a cutting edge rabbi, dude. Actually, I recommend checking him out. He's got some really bold things about love.
Okay.
And he spoke at the mastermind, and he was like the spiritual teacher guy.
Okay.
So I ended up connecting with him at the event. And at the time, me, not very spiritual at all. Like, and back then, I'd been in the military. I had gone through like a scientific degree program.
Reality based.
I was like, yeah,
super
if I
grounded.
I got to touch it and sniff it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it's real,
Yeah.
And so, and my introduction to psychedelics specifically was really new. Okay. So I was like very like atheist type thing. But this guy the stuff he was saying made a lot of sense. So I went and talked to this guy, Mark Gaffney, and we hung out over the weekend, and he invites me. He's like, hey, I got this group I'm putting together, and you want to join? It's a think tank for how to change the world and bring more love to the entire world. I go, sounds good to me. Sure. I like love. It's great, And
it's a cool book club.
Yeah, and part of it was there were some. I was like the youngest, least well known guy in the room. There's about 75 people that were part of this.
That's such an intimidating and exciting thing at the same time.
Yeah, there was like executives from Google coming to speak to our group.
Yeah,
like John Mackey from Whole Foods was part of the group. Like I really was like I had a popular YouTube channel. That was like my thing.
Yep.
And these guys were major players. And so I ended up joining this thing, and then I ended up, and Ken Wilber is one of the leaders of it. So it's Mark Gaffney and Ken Wilber. And I ended up being able to attend 3 events where I got to share space. And I go, man, every time this Ken Wilber guy speaks, my mind just melts. And so I started studying all of his stuff. And that's how I was introduced to it. So it was, I didn't realize like how, like when I started going through the material, I go, wow, he's explaining this way better than anyone has been able to explain anything to me before.
Yeah.
And his idea behind integral theory is, this is a guy, Ken Wilber has studied every religion, every style of governance, sociology, psychology. This guy is just he's reading like multiple books a day type of. He's one of these guys. So and he and Mark would go back and forth a lot because Mark's one of those guys too. Yeah,
he was looking for like the broadest scope possible, right? Like
he's got a book called A Theory of Everything.
Yeah, broadest scope.
and he's like, okay, let's see what they have in common. What do they have in common that works, and keep that, and what do they not have in common, and throw that out.
Yep.
And so he was able to create some models that would help us sift through the information.
Yep.
And so I, coming from like a background where I was like, I'm not really sure about this God thing and spirituality, and then having somebody be able to break it down in such an intellectual way, because I love intellectual conversations.
Yeah.
And I go, oh, okay, well, this makes sense to me. And that actually allowed my mind to calm down enough for me to have other things develop.
Or just like your whole nervous system, right? Your nervous system's like, oh, can't hear it, right?
Exactly.
It's uncomfortable. It's new. It's different. I have resistance to it. Mm-hmm. But he broke down that resistance with the words.
With the words. Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that I pride myself on being good at myself as well, is that I'm able to take these concepts and then describe them in a way that people go, huh.
Yep.
And then they take that sigh and they relax. And now I can talk to someone's heart instead of just their head.
I feel like my clients would say that about me, but I always feel like I lack that. Like I always struggle with that because I hear people like you talk, or I hear some of the guests that I have on, and I'm always in awe of the way people talk about various things, because we live in our own heads, right? So right. I hear it repeated the way that I hear it in my own head 100 times. But then if I hear somebody else speak, that external perspective, even if it's a 1% shift around the perspective, that those words hit differently, and it kind of creates more of a complete picture in your head of something.
Yeah. Different perspectives, fill in the gaps. Yeah. I've been a coach for a long time, and I've had, I've worked with clients for a year, and they go to somebody else and they come back and go, wow, I did this. And I was like, the thing I told you to do 6 months ago,
yeah.
Like, yeah, but I was like, okay, you couldn't hear it the way I was saying it.
Yeah.
You need to hear it from somebody else. So I've always encouraged my clients to listen to other people as well.
You plant the seeds, right? And then you
Right.
have to hear it repeated in multiple different ways. My clients do the same thing, right? They'd be like, oh, have you ever heard of this? I'm like, yeah, I told you about it 6 months ago. That's fine. But I love that too, though, you know, because like you, in some ways you have to be on your own journey to have that perspective and open-mindedness enough to integrate it into who you are, right? Like you have to, like people don't know unless they experience it. And that's always the hardest thing. I always have a hard time explaining like nervous systems. I work with a lot of nervous system stuff, and it's so hard to describe that to people. I'm getting trained in neurofit coaching, so they do a great job of breaking it down, and they've given me like tools and words to describe it, which I love. But that embodied piece, like to describe, like it's like sort of like watching a movie, right? And they try to portray in films different concepts, like if somebody's like passed away and you see their ghost, like that sense of a spirit there or something like that, right? Like, or if the way they try to perceive like disassociation in movies, or like multiple personalities in movies, right? Like you're watching it on a screen, but they're trying to depict it in a way that you know what it feels like in your body, right? Like, but they do it with images, which is different than doing it with words, right? Words is a way different ball game.
Yeah. It's I think, I don't know, more or less skill. It's just different.
Yeah. I in preparation for this, I was listening to Ken Wilber talk on a podcast, and it is interesting because in school they talk about choosing your theory, or choosing your modality, or choosing whatever as a therapist. And I always was like, I think we should draw, because there are only pieces from each one that kind of make sense to me, and the rest of it's kind of junk, right? And he pulls from the 4, which we'll talk about in the next section, but he pulls from the 4, big categories. Transrelational is one of them. Behaviorist, existential. I don't know. I'll go over it next.
I you know what? Because I teach it, I don't.
You don't have the.
I really simplify it.
Yeah.
So if I start using some of that language, I lose people.
Yeah.
So I just stop using it. So I actually don't even remember.
Well, I'll look over and I'll go through the 4 the way that he like described it in this podcast. But they call that idea as in mental health as eclectic, or not integrative. It's not integrative, but they use like words like that to describe, if you don't choose a theory, you don't choose a path, and, condition yourself to that path, then you're eclectic, right? Which is kind of nothing. And then these professionals go out in the world and they have an identity associated with like the modality or the theory. Otherwise they can't talk about themselves, right? They have a hard time explaining to people what they do if they're eclectic, right? But this Ken Wilber gives people a way to actually live in that literal eclectic space with effective pieces involved, right? Like, so it's such a different thing.
Well, I think that's even common amongst coaches. It's like, what do you do? And they start talking about how they do what they do. They start talking about their method instead of the results they get their clients. My clients start here and they end here.
Right.
And that's good sales too.
Yeah.
And so anytime I get in with like someone who's got an academic background and we're trying to help them get clients, it's like, forget all that.
Yeah.
I understand it's difficult.
Forget your conditioning. Shocker.
Yeah.
Forget your conditioning.
Yeah. And focus on that. And so that's, in a world where people are the method, it can be very difficult to like pull that apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I'm so glad you introduced me to integral theory, and that's wild that Ken Wilber himself introduced you to integral theory.
Yeah, pretty wild.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and actually when I saw him for the first, I didn't realize how hard he would be to get in the same room type of thing. Like it's like rare. He's a bit of a hermit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my favorite psychologist was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He was always my favorite. He relatively recently passed away, and right before he died, he was on a speaking tour, and I was like, I know he's older, I don't know how much opportunity I would have to see him speak. And it was $10,000 a ticket to go see him speak. And I was like,
wow.
I'm probably not going to ever see him speak, but he created flow states, flow theory. So if you ever watch like the Red Bull Air Force or Red Bull do any of their Flugtag or any of the fun stuff that Red Bull does, They have the Flow Genome Project, and they study flow states. You might also be familiar with them through like the movie Transformers, and they do a lot of movie stunts and things like that. That's all evolution out of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's original idea of flow states, and it's you see it everywhere now because people just want to be in the zone, you know. But I think
that's the first psychologist I ever read.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Yeah.
Did you know how to say his name when you first read it?
I was in college. I had a funny way of remembering. I was like chicks and knee highs.
Yeah. Everybody gets stumped unless you like know and like practice it some way. Everybody gets stumped. They're like, what's his name? It's a lot of letters. A lot of letters. But so I want to talk a little bit more about not necessarily the research behind integral theory. We'll use the more academic terms, and then you can add, the finesse in the next section. All right. Welcome to The Approach. All our sections are named after Joseph Campbell's journey.
So
I think
I like that.
Most people are like, what? I was like, Michael will appreciate that. So when I was listening to the podcast, preparing for the show, the way that Ken Wilber talked about it to describe it to the interviewer was that he combined essentially. So when I talked about the 4 pillars of mental health, I talk about your mind, like your beliefs, values, thoughts. I talk about your physical body, your physiological health, which is not taught anywhere in psychology ever, which is mind-blowing to me. The physical health of your brain, which is also not talked about anywhere in psychology outside of like medication and like serotonin and dopamine, which we still like, it's not talked about well.
Right.
Physical health of your brain, physical health of your body, thoughts, values, beliefs, and then the external, anything outside of yourself, your relationships, politics, cultural, social, stuff like that. So that's how I talk about it. But then when you talked about it, I was like, it's oddly also Ken Wilber talked about it in 4s. So he talked about pulling the 4 styles, like overgeneralized styles of psychology together. And it was behaviorism, psychoanalysis, humanistic, existential, and transpersonal, which I was like, that's I like that. Like that's kind of how I describe what I do as a therapist is like those 4. I just never really thought of it the way he described that combination. But then it gets even deeper than that because we talked about the AQAL. Is that how you say it? AQAL?
AQAL.
AQAL chart.
Yeah, a lot of times people call it AQAL Map.
Yeah.
AQAL.
Yeah.
Yeah, map.
So that talks about, internal, external self, right? Mind, body, and then internal, external we.
Yes.
Social?
Yeah. And it's really, that's the map I am able to use with clients. And when I'm talking to a crowd, that's the one that seems to be able to, like, people can grasp.
Yeah.
And so the internal, like, it's 4 quadrants, and the top half is self, the lower half is the we, the external, the collective, and then the upper, and then the left side of that quadrant is internal,
internal, external,
internal, and then right side is external.
Yeah, internal, external.
So the upper left hand
culture.
corner, like the upper left hand corner is going to be the internal self, the thoughts, emotions, all the stuff that you were describing.
Internal me.
Yeah. Internal me, and what's happening internally, and then the external me, which is going to be the physical body, the brain, all that stuff, and then the external we is relation. The list is very long. By the way, I'm overgeneralizing tremendously because I find that if we list everything, it's not useful anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. So well, we'll put the graphic up too. Like we're going to put a picture up so you can see it.
Cool.
And then you can see actually all the things that fall within those categories right on that map.
Right.
And that right there in and of itself is such a clear example of like the complexity of mental health in general, or just like living a good life in general, all the things that go into it. There it is.
Yeah. 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 And that's actually that's your slide from your show. Yep. Yeah. That's a very simplified. Yeah. Very simplified. And so, one of the things that's really cool is, we have the internal we, that's the relationships, external we, that's the physical environment. But if we look at like what's happening internally, internal me and internal we, and we just go, well, what's happening in the language? Like culture is dictated by language and is limited by law or by, I call it statutes, man-made statutes, which is different than law, in my opinion. But not much of an opinion. But laws don't need to be enforced.
By a fact.
Laws don't need enforcement. Statutes do. Policies need to be enforced by a person. But there's, if you look at this, and so what I really love about this is one of the things I really work for my clients is I want them to be as resourced as possible. And so you're talking about how a lot of therapists are completely unfamiliar with what's happening in the physical body and the impacts. And so when I look at this, I go, wow, let's just make people as resourced as possible. And if I want to help create transformation for somebody, if somebody wants to experience their life differently, then most of the time people are an expert at one quadrant. They're really good at the internal self, or they're really good at the physical body, they're really good at relationships, or they're really good with their environment. They've figured out one of those.
So it'd be like an example of like, if you're going to do like individual, external, maybe you go to the gym a lot, you work on your physical fitness, right? If you're internal, you might consider yourself to be more of an activist, maybe something like that.
Or you might be somebody who really, the internal you could be really good at just building relationships. Okay. You could be very good at I ran into this a lot in the West Coast, is a lot of people who they put everything into their relationships, and they had like multiple relationships, you know, the polyamorous community. And it was like, oh, I am meeting people who relationships is the most important thing and the thing that they are best at. Physical health, not so much. Internal, like their own mental health.
Right.
And so like, it's rare to find someone who's even mastered two of these.
Right. And
so what I like to point this out, because most people when they have the awareness of the four quadrants, we can go, well, which one have you had the least experience in, or has gotten the least amount of attention? We may be able to do something in that other quadrant. So like if you're a mental health professional and you go, oh, maybe if we tweaked something in your physical health, you're going to become more resourced.
Yep.
So like if I want to cause transformation, you need to be exposed to some things that are really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And if you're not very well resourced, you're going to shut down.
Yep.
And you won't experience that transformation.
Totally.
And so like we got to create, this is where conversations around safe space and validation and all validation kind of drives me nuts. Like,
yeah, same.
Okay, cool. I was wondering about that. Like,
nope, not
like,
a fan.
That's one thing I've noticed in therapy world is like this is like, it's like the validation never ends.
And that's because therapists themselves don't feel resourced. It's because they don't have the tools to help their clients. And they think that if they can just lean on the validation piece and create the safe space and be a sounding board, which is, it was funny because when I originally became a therapist, my first business idea was to call it my sounding board. And then I quickly was like, nope, it's not me. It's not what I'm going to do. And it was because I was scared. It was because I was like, okay, well, I can just reflect back what you're saying to me so you can hear your internal thoughts, but that's not affecting any sort of solution or change. And if you can get comfortable with being uncomfortable, like then you can make change, but the therapist themselves has to be able to do that too. And I think that's a huge difference that I see in the therapy world versus the coaching world, is that coaches embody and therapists don't embody as much as coaches do, right? Like a coach is going to live out the thing that they're like, you've probably done this, right? Like you've worked on the four quadrants yourself, right? And therapists say that they do that because they say, oh, well, I go to therapy. And it's like, great, well, you're just getting validated by somebody else that doesn't embody.
Right.
Right. So
when people ask me like, what's your education? And I go, well, I did this program, this program, this program, this program. I didn't do these programs. I didn't drink this ayahuasca so that I could learn how to teach something.
Right.
Or to help anybody else at all.
Yeah. I did it for my own path, my own journey.
I was helping myself.
Yeah.
I was trying to help myself.
And don't you want to learn from people that learn to help themselves?
Yeah, right? Exactly. and I'm like, I've had conversations with people who are, highly academically trained, and we get in a conversation, they go, where'd you learn that?
Yeah.
That's that method. I'm like, oh, it occurred to me in ayahuasca. And they go, yeah, but this guy invented it, this method. I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah, cool.
Now I know the name of it. Like, it's like, do you want to learn more? I'm like, I don't know, maybe. It seems to be working the way I'm doing it.
That was like the moment I had when I heard you speak, because I was like thinking of like my idea of the 4 pillars, and I'm like, oh, trying to put all these pieces together, and then just to have this show up, I was like, oh, like it was validating and also challenging at the same time. And I was like, oh, thank God I'm not the only person that's like, how do we, not that I would be, but like, you know, when you see that, when you can sort of seek out new information or seek out new experiences and get over that nervous system response, get over that fear and face, that's what facing that fear is, then you can find that alignment with other people and other ideas that are connected to the way you're thinking about things, and then you're not alone anymore. And then
Yep.
right?
Yep.
It's like this whole process of not shutting yourself down around, you know, just your nervous system response and your fear of whatever it is that you're scared of in that moment.
Yeah. So going back to the quadrants, if someone's not resourced in one of the areas, it's going to make it very difficult for transformation. And so, you know, I've been in scenarios where people are in a week-long retreat and they experience some type of transformational thing, and then they go back to their old environment, and then there's struggle.
Yep.
And they're not taught to shift their environment. Like, it's okay. I've even seen coaches do this where they're like, you know, just wait 90 days afterwards to make any changes. I'm like, whoa.
Why?
It's like, go make the change.
Yeah.
Like, you got the insight.
Yep.
Just do it. And I think that part of that's kind of like with the medical model, where like people are just so afraid of the liability, right? Like if they regret what they do, and now it's going to reflect poorly on me. But yeah, my job is to make sure everyone's extremely resourced as much as we can in all 4 quadrants. For one, let's look at all 4 quadrants. Is there a lack of resources? Sometimes just increasing the resources in one quadrant, all of a sudden your entire life just gets better. All you did was add vitamin D. In the morning on, you know, for a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden your mood completely changes. You're not depressed anymore. That's all you needed.
Well, and people don't think it's that simple, right? We overcomplicate everything. Yeah. And they're like, what do you mean? I just need to get sunshine in the morning? And you're like, yeah, just try it. And they're like, that's way too simple. And like, you see that echoed everywhere. You see it all over social media, and we like to deflect with humor, but that deflection becomes an internalization. And then all of a sudden people don't realize the subtle shifts that you could make that would be simple changes. And we overcomplicate the change. So, and this is from studying, you know, years of behavior. This is what I learned in school. This is what was conditioned, right? These years of studying behavior change and addiction, right? I worked with addiction for a really long time. And that was the number one thing with addiction. Everyone's like, it's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. And it's like, well, now it's definitely going to be hard. If you can't make these like 1% shifts, then, and that's coaching. The coaching world is what taught me the 1% shift. Certainly not the therapy world. And I think therapists like to think they're the smartest person in the room, right? They always want to, and I'm guilty of this too, right? Like even in that example with the 4 quadrants and like my 4 pillars, I'm like, oh shit, right? Like my ego comes on board, and it's like, yeah, you're behind and you didn't do it. Somebody did it first, and blah, blah. And that's such a vibe in the mental health world, right? But if everybody can set their egos down and open themselves up to some new information, then maybe we could make change a little bit easier instead of making it so hard so that the world like needs us to function. And because you don't need us to function. Like you can find this information on podcasts and books, and go to lectures, and, you know, talk to people, go to How Do You Health Fest like I did. Like it's simple. It's not that hard. Yeah. We make it hard. Use the 4 quadrants, pick one thing.
Yeah. And so, you know, be resourced, and then a tweak in one quadrant, a tweak in your environment might cause the transformation you're looking for. Like what I love about the quadrant for environment is a lot of these things you change at one time. You don't have to form a new habit. The habits form themselves around how you shifted the environment. Like for one instance of this is ditch the TV in the living room and reorganize your furniture to be for conversations. And so like I don't have a TV in my living room at home.
Yep.
And so
I was thinking about that when you're coming over today. I was like, shit, I have a massive TV in my living room. Mike's gonna be like, I don't have a TV in my living room. All my shame came up. I was like, ugh. Football season. Yeah. Spent too much money for no reason.
Yeah. I mean, and your environment's optimizing for whatever it is that you're doing, right? Like if you're optimizing for football, then like all the furniture is going to be pointed at the TV.
Yep.
And you're going to have that. And if you were to move that TV to another room, or one thing I like to do is maybe even just get a projector and something I have to pull down.
Yeah.
Like I have to go through some extra steps to make it available.
Yep.
Because I like to watch TV. But
do you judge it like I do? Do you watch TV and you're like, fuck this? Do you do you pull out all the issues and all the poor messaging that
I have a lot. I'm constantly in analysis. That's true.
Yeah.
I'm constantly in analysis of like all speech, and it's not I don't feel judgmental about it. What I'm doing when I'm listening is I'm translating, because there's what people really mean, and then there's what they're saying.
Yep.
And most people don't know how to communicate what's actually happening in their experience. So I'm in when I first started learning these skills of actually understanding what somebody means, it was groundbreaking for one. And then it took me a while to realize, like I was trying to get other people to speak more clearly and tell me actually what was happening in their experience.
Yep.
And I realized that I would have to take them through a seminar in order to get them to have to converse with me in the way that I wish to be conversed with. And so then I took it on to just simply translate for people like when they're talking. So the same thing happens if I go to a movie. I'm like translating. I go, oh, okay, I see the propaganda here, and like where this makes sense why most of society thinks like this. And
that's such a huge distinction to make too, because I think that's part of like the divisiveness that we experience is some people see the show or the movie or what they're saying, but some people interpret what is meant by what they're saying. And if you're just looking at what somebody's saying, you are getting programmed by the thing that you think it is, instead of looking deeper at the meaning that it's portraying. And that's huge. And like you even did that at How Do You Health Fest. You're like, I was like, oh, I loved your talk. And you're like, tell me why. And I was like, oh shit, I got to like verbalize specific things. But it's a challenge for people. And I think it's an important challenge for people, because otherwise we're that whole like message, that sender message receiver type communication, like that's how we communicate, right? But we don't think that that's how we communicate. We just say words and hope it lands. And it usually is getting filtered through always is getting filtered through somebody else's lens or perspective. So learning how to talk about what you actually feel or actually mean or actually saying, that's huge.
It is huge. Yeah.
And the words that you just used to describe that, I think, are massively important too, because that's, again, and as therapists, that's not how it's described, right? You're tasked with diagnosis, right? You're not tasked with understanding where somebody's coming from or why they might be coming from that place. You're just told to look for signs and symptoms and then put a label on the signs and symptoms to help you understand how to categorize that person to give them whatever evidence-based treatment.
Well, so that they can report it to their insurance company.
Yeah. Yes. Ding, ding, ding. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, like I say that because I believe that psychotherapy is not flawed at its root.
Right.
It's existing inside of a system that's flawed.
Yes. Yep. And that's also a key distinction, which I'm determined to break down. I think a lot of therapists are, though. Like a lot of people don't want to use insurance anymore for that reason, right?
That's
people
right.
don't understand what they're doing. When you're reporting to a third party, you don't understand. It's the same as like agreeing to your Apple agreement or your Netflix subscription, right? You don't know actually what you're agreeing to when you're sending out, third party agreements to an insurance company, to people who don't know who you are and aren't trained in mental health and don't know how that information is going to be used. And a lot of people, it's fine, but it might not be. It really might not be.
You're opening yourself up.
Yeah.
You're opening yourself up, and you got to consider who you're opening yourself up to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyways, I'll digress on the insurance argument. One of the things I did want to mention about the research behind this, right? Because part of this is the research and education part. I'll read this quote from an article, and this is not to debunk the theory at all, but it says that WIP, so it's Wilber's integral theory, psychology, in general lacks the methods for validation and or falsification, failing, therefore, to fulfill the criteria of scientific theories and the ground for scientific research. Yet by identifying the central elements of various abstract psychological theories in a coherent system, and by offering a coherent categorization, the authors believe that WIP may deliver value to epistemology, I can never say that word, sociology of science, and spiritual philosophy. And I found that to be really interesting because I was trying to look up the research, and of course, some of the best models you can't find research for because they can't be researched.
Right.
They can't be fit into a deniable model.
Right. Yeah. When I look at Ken Wilber's work, I see it's a meta-analysis that's so huge that if he were to start including all the data, he would have to dedicate his whole life to that.
Yeah.
Right. And he's creating a level of understanding of principles versus
depth
needing to be, instead of needing to be validated scientifically, and the fact that at the end of that comment was around spiritual studies or something like that.
Yeah, spiritual philosophy.
I think that it's really cool to be alive right now, because if you're following a lot of the psychology research that comes out, it's validating stuff in the Yoga Sutra.
Yeah.
Right. This study came out and said, I'm like, yeah, I learned that in yoga, not the poses yoga, working out, but the
doing yoga.
Yeah. I got the philosophy of yoga and which is highly scientific.
Yeah.
Which by the way, I was in this conversation this week and they were like, "Oh, you have a scientific mind." I was like, "I'm just paying attention." Yeah. Just if you're paying attention, that's probably good enough. And yoga's really good at.
You can't be focused on getting it right if you're paying attention, right? It can't be a right or wrong, good or bad dichotomy. It has to be just paying attention for paying attention's sake. That's it.
Yeah, I'm just paying attention.
Yeah,
and I've gotten really good at paying attention, and I've avoided a lot of pitfalls because of it. And people are like, "Oh man, you saw that?" I was like, "I was just paying attention. I wasn't somewhere else."
Yep.
And that's a lot of just the yoga philosophy, being present.
Yep.
And paying attention. And there's, they didn't develop the modern scientific inquiry, but if you study that, you're like, oh, it's very scientific.
Yeah.
And to watch all this research come out, I'm like, oh, that's funny because science has over the years, it's like okay, we have this with Descartes, right? We have science over here, and then we have religion over here. Yeah. And psychology fell in the religion category for a really long time. Yeah. Right. And then it's like, oh, we should start studying this, and we can actually create, we can validate through research these things, and we're going to start studying this.
We can create whole systems on it, and industries and corporations.
Yes, and it's
use it.
The way I see it is science has the scientism as a religion keeps taking away from all the other religions.
Yeah, it's co-opting the spiritual space, or
it's oh, we have research to suggest this now. Now it's scientific and it's true, but before it was bullshit.
Before it was not true. So we had to falsify it. Well, that's the other thing too that people don't understand about science too, is that they think it's proving something true, but it's actually proving things false, right?
Right.
It has to be deniable for it to.
And then the idea of proving, anytime anyone starts, it drives me nuts when I see a PhD use the words this proves. I'm pretty sure when I was in school, you're not there's not many things to be proved. Right. There's evidence to suggest.
Yep.
And I think that's another thing that's really run rampant in our society is there's proof of this, and the claims to truth are ridiculous.
Yeah.
The amount of it. One of the things I help clients with is we use language that helps to soften up what they think reality is. I want to soften up your perception. And this is where the validation drives me nuts, is because sometimes if a therapist gets into wanting to validate somebody's experience, and I'm like, no, I want to actually slowly help them erode their attachment to that as a true experience and more of a, this is just my perception of what's happening or happened. If I can make that really soft, like I've made it really soft for myself through my language and things like that, you won't hear me that anything was ever proved. You won't hear that come out of my mouth.
Yeah.
I won't use the word truth.
You didn't claim to be an expert based off these scientific methodologies.
Right. Yeah. I'm not gonna claim something to be true unless it's highly objectively, inarguably true. Like there's a table in the middle of this room. Everyone's going to agree with me on that.
Yeah, right? I can touch it. I can see it. I can smell it. I can.
Yeah. So we have a whole society, and we have a lot of scientists who are acting as priests, and they're talking about things as being true or proven, and it's really made it difficult for the masses because they believe them. These people hold authority, and I see part of my work is just like softening up people's perception, and so that they can be more ready to see reality.
Well, and it makes me think of that medical industry ego states, right? Like, you can't attach to a trend or like for example, a lot of people look for like EMDR. They look for specific things when they're looking for therapists, right? You can't identify something that you're looking for if you don't know it exists, right? So, and the medical industry and some of these professionals, they get so in their ego, and like ego and shadow work and all these things have taken on such a popular trend socially. I think because a lot of people think that they're like broken or bad, right? It still comes back to, we try to like digress from religion, but we still see ourselves as being like good or bad or right or wrong, right? We're still like struggling to like wrestle with that inherent value system of morals. And the ego states of the professionals, like people say detach, right? So this is how I look at ego states. Like this is how I describe it. I try to describe it as like that voice in your head that tells you you're doing something wrong or fucking something up, or right. Like it's fear based because it's like, oh, better not do that. Right. Or else you're going to get shunned from society. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to experience pain, something like that. In the classic Freudian state, right, there was id, superego, and then the ego was the balance of the two. So when you're a kid, you're at play, right? Your id, like everything's free and fun and social and open and warm and like exciting. And then your superego comes in, your parent state, your critical parent comes in and it tells you all the things you're doing wrong because it's scared. So you internalize those fears from your parents. So today everyone thinks of ego as being like egotistical and they want to detach from those ego states, right? They're like, we don't want, but it's like, no, you need to strengthen your ego state, right? And then you look at these professionals that are out there doing that they're trying to establish themselves with authority or expertise because they worked hard for their degree or whatever, and their careers depend on it, and there's all this stuff rubbed into it. They may not even know why they became experts or professionals in the first place. So they're so like highly unaware of those ego states, and a lot of people are like afraid of even saying that they have an ego. And it's like, you look at that and you're just like, okay, these are the people that you're trusting with the science. These are the people that you're revering as experts that have no psychological or intellectual or emotional or social depth, right? They're just basing it off of those research studies. They're basing it off of like, these just pieces of paper at the end of the day, like I said earlier.
Yeah, the ego conversation. I have one course that I have that I have a slide that said it brings up Ryan Holiday's "Ego is the Enemy" book, and I'm like, put a big X through it. I'm like, ego is your ally. Yeah. And
yeah, absolutely. Because narcissism comes from detachment from ego, right? It comes from that, like, it's not grandiose, like I love myself so much. It's actually, I can't tolerate how much I don't like myself and how much I'm the center of my own pain and suffering.
But externalize it out on everybody else.
Yeah.
So I think about like the ego conversation is interesting because not everyone can agree on the definition of ego. Because is this a Freudian ego? Is this like, are we talking about like Carl Jung then came in and like redefined it, and it's like keeps evolving. It's like, what is it? And I really just think about it as just the story we have about ourselves and the world and identity. And so like this, maybe I don't want to pick on academics, but like it could be you know, a CEO who's attached to the title of CEO of a company, and then they make a bunch of poor decisions for their life.
Yeah.
Because they want to be perceived to hold that identity well.
And that's because we don't really know what we mean by identity, right? Like, but most people are like, oh, it's this shirt that I'm wearing. It's my I drink Black Rifle. Like, that's my identity. I'm a Black Rifle drinker. Like, but what happens if you stop drinking Black Rifle? Then who are you, right? Like, what happens if you're not a CEO anymore, or if you don't have that degree, or if you're not, you know, you don't wear pink sparkles anymore, or you didn't go to the Barbie movie? Like, what is, you know, like what are you now, right? Like, that's everybody's big identity now for the summer. It's Barbie. Everybody wants to be Barbie, which I think is a whole nother podcast. But
I saw Barbie yesterday.
Did you?
I did.
Do you want to talk about what you think of it? Or? No.
I think there's a lot to be. I liked it.
Yeah.
But a lot to be translated.
Yeah. Right back to translation.
And it's you know, I actually think if you pay attention, overall, it's a fairly good message.
Yeah.
But I don't think most people are going to get it.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. I'm just fascinated by how
I could just see a bunch of people going and hating the patriarchy, you know.
Yeah. That's I mean, everybody hates the patriarchy. Again, that's
no one knows what the patriarchy is.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
It's like I was watching the movie, I'm like, they're not even talking about the patriarchy. They're just using patriarchy.
They're just using the word.
And then like shitting on it. Like,
yeah. And now Ryan Gosling's the poster child or something for healing. I don't know. I don't know.
Although I think it ended with like a good balance there.
Okay.
But I don't know if everyone was going to catch it.
I just think it's funny how not too long ago, everybody was just hating on Barbie because of body image stuff.
Totally.
Just absolutely hating on Barbie. And now we're just upholding her and revering her as like the pinnacle of pop culture.
I think the movie was like a solution. It was like Mattel was like, we got to solve this problem. We have a PR issue here. It's like, it is about that.
Because they brought back the whole 1950s, like there was rooted. I watched the whole thing and how Greta, came up and wanted to root it in the 1950s. And I think that all that's just like, even that's wild, right? Like,
yeah. It was.
It's a whole
I think it's worth watching.
Yeah.
It's worth watching.
I'll definitely go see it. But
I also watched Sound of Freedom to balance it out.
Okay.
Sound of Freedom on Friday, Barbie on Sunday.
Okay. Sound of Freedom first.
Sound of Freedom first.
Hardcore things, then play.
Exactly.
So what did you think of Sound of Freedom?
Wow. Yeah, that was a movie that I can't even break down. Yeah. Like if you were to say like, even what is your favorite part or whatever, it's like there was no like single moment that stood out, whereas in a lot of movies there are.
Yeah.
It was just this big emotional experience, like just emotionally like building and building and building. And I was heavily impacted by it. And I actually had a good cry.
Yeah.
I walked out of the theater and like had a really like weepy cry.
Because it's based in reality, not... Right?
Yeah. And one of the things that I was like, why is this impacting me so much? Like, this is just really heavy on me. And then I just had these memories come up. I was in the Navy, and we actually we were off the coast of Somalia, and we ran into. We thought the ship was sinking. It was, and we got there, and it was a slave trade. Wow. And so it was at the time, like I was very. Like emotionally stoic, 23 years old, thought I was a badass, like, and I didn't know who these people were,
right.
They were just people, it was sad. It was sad to see what was happening.
Yeah. You're probably also in like go mode, right? Like if you're in like a rescue type of mission, your nervous system's focused on the mission. Yeah. It's not focused on the feelings that you might have about it. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to function.
That's right. Yeah, and there was 4 days where we took care of them though. There was a rescue, and then we had them for 4 days, and we couldn't take them back to Somalia because we don't recognize their government, and so we actually had to wait for the U.S. Coast Guard, which, by the way, I didn't know this until I was in the Navy, guards the coasts all over the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
food for thought.
Yeah, just think about it.
Yep.
And so you're saying it's not just a clever name.
That's right.
It's literal. They're being literal.
Yeah, these
fascinating how literal things can be.
Yeah, I mean, they only did like around the continental, like the U.S. and our continent, and then when we had the war in Iraq, they brought all these ships, these boats that were not meant to cross the ocean. Like, and I really built for that. And we had to get them over there.
Yeah.
And, the Coast Guard was regularly sending people back. So they knew exactly, they had the way to do that without us getting too far off from where we were supposed to be doing. But,
they're like, we got this.
Yeah.
we know
how
to turn people around.
Yeah. We deal with slaves really often.
Wow.
Like, okay. So, that brought back, it was like, it wasn't triggering in it back then back then wasn't that heavy, but the heaviness, the reality of that moment, I was like, it was like that movie allowed me to see all the stories of the people who were on that boat in that moment. It was just like, it all hit me at one time. How old am I? 40? Yeah. 18 years later, I'm like, whoa.
Nobody knows how old they are past 34. It's fine.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't know when that was. Yeah. So and I remember coming back and experiencing a bit of, I've had frustration around it my whole life since then, which is people start talking about how bad things are or slavery or whatever. I'm like, the shit is still happening.
It's still happening.
Like, you're complaining about this thing right here, which is extremely subjective. And yet there's someone on chains on a boat over there.
I said that to a colleague of mine a couple of years, I think it was like 2019, 18, 19. And she was like, can you believe there's those kids in cages? And I was like, there's people in cages all over the world. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And then she didn't talk to me ever again. But it's just.
Yeah. Well, I remember, was it 2011, 2012, the Coney thing? Mm-hmm. People were so upset about it. I remember I was interacting with a lot of people in their I was younger then too, and a lot of these people in their 20s, and I see these college students, and they're like, we should do something about this Coney guy. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of bad dudes out there. Like, there's a lot of people, like, he just made the media for some reason. Yeah. Like,
well, it goes back to tolerating discomfort, right? Like, if you want to have any kind of an awakening and wake up to yourself and wake up to the world, because a lot of healing, I think, is like you with yourself, you with the world, and then you in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to wrestle with the fact that the world is like you can't adjust it to you to be more comfortable. Right.
Yeah,
like
you
can try. Yeah. Well, we've clearly been trying, but yeah, you wind up miserable. You wind up with a lot of people that are miserable, that feel like victims, that feel helpless in their own lives, when there's actual real victims out there that get lost in the wash because we're, hyper vigilant on people that are creating victimhood instead of people that need actual help.
Yeah. I mean, I told all those young people who were so upset about it, I was like, well, do something about it.
Do something. Yeah. Go ahead.
Go get an AR.
Yeah.
What's your joke? I can find somebody with a plane and we can get you over there. Yeah. Take care of it.
Yeah.
Like I served.
Yeah.
We did our best.
Yeah.
Like, and you're demanding something, you go
get up, young buck.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mike has a joke in his comedy set and he says, what did he say? Something.
It's everybody's like, oh, I stand with Ukraine. It's like, okay, but you're not doing anything about it. You're adding a profile picture.
Are you going to stand in Ukraine?
It's a lot easier to stand with Ukraine than it is to stand in Ukraine.
I like that. I like that. True.
Yep. Yeah. I was talking with the creators of the Shiftwave chair. And they were talking about how they sent Shiftwave chairs over to Ukraine. And I was like, well, there you go. There's somebody there doing something, taking action and doing something.
I was going to say it's like thoughts and prayers.
Yeah. I'll send you all the positive vibes.
Send thoughts and prayers. Just don't send any Stinger missiles,
Just a bunch of people, Care Bear staring. Sending all the vibes.
Yeah. We live in an interesting society.
Yeah. Action's a big piece, though. Action, like, again, with the validation, right? You can validate people all day, but if they're not resourced and they don't know how to take action. Right. And then, the other thing I hear, I appreciate you sharing that story, because a lot of people will...
I had to make up for the Barbie,
To ground myself in some masculinity. I was also a soldier, okay? I saw the movie, but I've saved slaves in real life, so... Yep. So, but that healing piece, like, people are always resentful about the fact that there's always more layers and there's always more depth and there's always something deeper to do with themselves, right? And and people are always trying to like get rid of their trauma, and it's like they look at you as a therapist and they're like, well, just get rid of it, right? Like am I done? Am I done with, like, did I get to the finish line? And you're like, it's a hard thing to explain, right? There's the difference between going through what you went through, the immediate aftermath of what you went through, and then here years later, re-experiencing it from a different place in your life, and that still being a memory and experience that you had that's ingrained in part of who you are, right? And that's what we miss with identity, right? We try to force ourselves into these we try to dress up like Barbie,
Well,
right?
I would say the memory is not even who we are, though.
Well, I don't mean like it's who we are, but it's like it's the experiences that like color, like you know what I mean. Like
Yeah.
I think who we are basically at its core is like our personality. Like I think that that's like probably the most like scientific thing that you could pin on who we are.
Yeah.
But outside of that, you have like your experiences, right? And you have the way that your experiences affected you in your life, and you can choose to look at that in different ways, right? Like you could choose to take something that was absolutely terrifying and let it terrify you for the rest of your life, or you could heal it and have that be a scar that you wear, but it's not an open wound that you just keep picking at, right?
There's I mentioned this. I'm working with a coach right now that probably the best coach I've ever worked with. Not probably, she is. She doesn't call it trauma.
Yeah,
She calls it boo-boos.
I love that.
And,
I love that.
like, because she talks about, two little kids on the playground, 4 years old, and they get in a fight, or someone takes a toy from someone else, and they're like so upset. 5 minutes later, they're best friends again, right? And she was like, "It's a boo boo." Like these memories are just boo boos.
Yeah.
You're okay.
Yeah.
You're still
You're okay.
here.
Yeah.
Everything's good. You're safe.
Yeah.
It's just a boo boo. And I think, I asked her about that, and she goes, "Yeah, I don't use that language because it makes it important."
Yeah. It makes something unimportant important. Yeah. Well, and that's why I always take things from your nervous system, because you kind of can't escape your nervous system, right? You can only learn to work with it. And when we're talking about trauma, when people say I have PTSD or CPTSD, they link it to some sort of experience, right? Well, something bad must have happened to me for me to be this way. And it's like, no, you have a nervous system. Any experience that you have in your life, big or small, it can impact your nervous system. Or if it's repeated, or if that memory or that image or that feeling and sensation is repeated over time, or your escape of it, your behavioral reaction in relation to it, that will create PTSD symptoms, right? Like, so when you're talking about trauma, you're just talking about how your nervous system's responding to the world, and you can't escape that. So, theoretically, if you want to call it trauma and you insist on calling it trauma, everybody's traumatized then, right? Like everybody has trauma.
It's also like the language of my trauma, my anxiety, my depression.
And identifying with it.
You're possessed.
Yeah.
Like it's a possession.
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah.
Which, what do we call when someone, they have a demon on board? It's a possession.
Yeah. Yeah. You need an
I have
exorcism.
anxiety. The demon of anxiety has possessed me. It's like, now we need an exorcism.
Yeah.
Or.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have it. Maybe you're having an experience of it.
Yeah.
You experienced it, and it just keeps flowing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's life. Right?
Yeah.
it's the state of being alive.
I wish that the more aware I became, the less emotions I experienced. But no, the emotions get stronger and stronger. Like, not stronger, but like my experience, my presence to the emotions are like, it's like, whoa, this is a really crazy ride. Yeah. And you were talking about, I had a client that I used to do week-long like emotional development stuff where we worked with people's boo-boos for a week. Yeah. And she was like, we were on an integration call weeks later. She goes, "When is this going to be over?" I was like, oh my God. I was like, how did you we've done all this and you still think there's an end? Yeah. I was like, well, you're always just starting.
Yeah, always. It's always day one.
Yeah.
And that's why the feelings get bigger, right? Like, I will say the more work that I've done, the more calm I've become. So like I can be more, or I can be like, I used to think that like my kind of like energetic side was like mania or ADHD or anxiety. And I was like, oh no, this is like who I am in a play state, right? Like open and compassionate, but also like excited and energized, but not defensive, right? There's like all these things that make it. And I have become more calm over time, but that experience of being in the moment with the feeling, right? It does make your emotions bigger in the moment, so you can have them in the moment that you're having them, right? Because if you're detaching from them or dissociating from them or whatever, right? Then you have to go back and process them, and then the work is never done because you're never willing to be in the moment with the
Right.
feeling itself. And then that's what it means to be alive, right? You see all these Instagram reels of people like jumping off pretty cliffs and you know what I mean? They're like, oh, I'm living my best life. And it's like, okay, you can still jump off that pretty cliff, but if you're not in your body to experience the moment, then there's no point in doing it.
Yeah. I think that's how some people get into their body.
Yeah.
You know, it
Or
gets
the
quiet
adrenaline.
for a moment, you
Yeah.
know, or I used to compete in CrossFit. It's like you got to do a maximum lift or do something really intense. It's like, it's the only time it gets quiet is when I'm doing a maximal physically effort thing.
Yeah.
And then I finally get tired. And
So do a guitar solo.
strumming over here. And it's like you're forcing yourself in your body just for a moment.
Yeah.
And then you're back to your mental state. You're back to the prison. And
That's that threshold state though, right? Like when you're not pushing your nervous system beyond the peak of like excitation, right? Like, or you're going to fall out and then numb out and then shut down. Like it's that happy threshold, right? Where you're like, get that it's a flow state, right? Like when it's hard enough, but also novel enough, but also, right? Like it's all of those things combined into one experience. So we've been talking forever on this one segment. So let's head on.
I don't know any different.
Let's head on to I get so involved with the conversations and like all the segments are like different lengths and have different things, but they all kind of tie together. And but I do want to move on to talking about, because we've been talking about some of the problems, right, with people. Let's talk about some of the ways that you can engage with the stuff with your own life. Okay, road back, road home. I still forget my own stuff. Road back.
I can't keep up with my own words. I was having a conversation with ChatGPT the other day about branding, and it was like, "Do you have any common phrases?" I go, "I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know what I
It's
say.
always changing."
I'm evolving, so my words change. But so, I mean, in a synopsis, so like we've talked about a lot of things today. If you could give people one tangible thing to talk about, one of the things, and I'll set this up because when I pulled stuff out of the notes from your lecture, the two things that stood out to me, one was take one thing from each quadrant, right? On the AQAL. I can't, cues are hard for me.
That's good.
Unless it starts.
AQAL. That's what I call it. Yeah.
Okay. Choose one from each quadrant. But another thing that you brought up in the talk, which I loved, was you brought up Byron Katie.
Yeah.
Right. And like, that's another one that's not talked about that much. And Byron Katie's like a game changer for a lot of people.
She's not an academic.
She's not.
Do you know her story?
I think I used to, but I don't remember. It's been so long.
I think the time frame was in the 80s, and she basically walked into the desert because she lost her mind.
Oh, okay.
She went crazy.
That. Okay.
She just straight up, like, the stress of life just ate her up. She was done. Like, if a psychotherapist had gotten a hold of her during that time, she would have been diagnosed and put in.
Oh, yeah. Medicated.
Yeah. Medicated, put in a room somewhere.
Schizophrenic, whatever. Yep.
Lost her mind. And I don't know all the details. I just know the broad strokes. But basically was able to realize that everything in her head was BS. And then she was able to lead other people.
Is it true?
Is it true? Yeah, she's got a 4-step process. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of language, and I like how Byron Katie has used language to basically, I was talking earlier about softening up your perception so that you can be in touch with reality. And her process is the simplest and deepest way of getting there.
Yep.
And I'm a huge fan of her stuff, because if you just go to YouTube and put her name in and then watch her work with people in like a seminar type environment, it's mind blowing. You're like,
she was one of the first like tools that I used in addictions counseling. I just read her books, and I'll give you the 4 questions.
You actually don't need that much. It's not complicated.
No, you don't. You definitely don't. You need the 4 questions, right? Is it true? Can you absolutely know that it is true? How do you react, and what happens when you believe that thought? And who would you be without it? Right. If I had to read them, because I forgot them.
Yeah.
But I came across her through addiction counseling work, and it was like kind of like Psych 101 or Therapy 101 for me was like Wayne Dyer, Eckhart Tolle, Don Miguel Ruiz, Byron Katie, that whole lot.
You got a good intro.
Oh yeah, that's what I consider like the foundation. Like
Yeah.
that's like the life altering like aha moment when you're like, oh, you start to decondition yourself. Right. And I feel like such a good foundation for people to start with. But, yeah, that was my input from your lecture. I was so excited that you brought it up. I was like, this guy's talking about Byron Katie. No way.
Byron Katie is the soft way to enlightenment is the way I see it. Yeah. There's another way that's much more aggressive, and less compassionate and kind.
I can't wait. That's my favorite kind.
There's a guy who wrote a trilogy. He's written many other books too. His name's Jed McKenna.
Okay.
No relation to Dennis McKenna or his brother Terrence. Jed McKenna, and Spiritual Enlightenment, The Damnedest Thing is the first of the trilogy.
Okay.
I only recommend it to people who are really ready to lose a big part of themselves quickly and surprisingly. It doesn't, all you have to do is read it and your ego starts transforming and really just dissipating. He's a real big fan of not replacing. Mm-hmm. So it's a total destructive process.
Yeah.
So you're destroying, pieces of the ego in your perception of reality, and things like scientific models, like I started realizing were incorrect. Like this idea of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. I go, oh my God, it's only 2 dimensions.
Okay. I haven't heard that one yet. I do a whole podcast.
Well, he didn't say anything about it. It's just one day I woke up and I realized I wasn't thinking in spectrums anymore.
Okay.
Like it had deconstructed. Reading the book started deconstructing these things I thought were very solid in my mind. Uh-huh. Like a spectrum.
Yeah.
You got the left and the right, and you got everything in between.
Yeah.
But then I started seeing everything spherically.
Yeah.
And
okay.
so,
yeah.
And I started thinking about, you're either this or that. I go, well, and then my mind is expanding into this more spherical perspective. And I go, I can't even talk about the things I was talking about before in the same way. Like I had to reconfigure everything.
So tell me if I'm thinking about this. So this is, when I always think of the I work with narcissists a lot. Okay. I always think of the narcissistic spectrum, right? I always talk about it being on I've given presentations in class in school on it being on a spectrum, and I always considered like writing it out, right? But when I was doing that work, I realized that the 2 ends of the spectrum meet eventually, right? So is that like what you're talking about with like it winds up being a whole circle? Like it winds up being or is it even more?
It's more
spherical than that.
Yeah, it's not a circle.
Yeah,
it's a sphere. It's like a basketball.
It's a whole. Yeah.
And there's just it opened me up to way more nuance. Okay. I guess is one way to put it.
Okay. I love that.
And
it's like blowing my mind right now. I'm like, spectrums aren't real. Like, shit.
They're made up.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Where can you point out a spectrum in reality?
Right. Yeah.
You can't.
You can't.
This is
outside of like a rainbow.
This is a mental model. This is a way that we can communicate with each other to make sense of the world.
Yeah. We like to organize it.
And it's not very nuanced. It lacks a lot of nuance, and yet we see this a lot in like, well, scientific papers and whatnot. And it's like, oh, there's just, and the scientific method is a bit restricted and limited in that there's so much isolation happening, but not a lot of integration.
Yep.
And so I think it's good for us to understand that's very good at isolating things, but not good at integrating things.
Yep.
And so something like a 2-dimensional spectrum is good for isolating, but we need to understand that it makes up like less than 1% of the conversation. Like it
blows diagnosis right out of the water, right? Like you can't diagnose.
Difficult.
Yeah, you can't
there's no diagnosis.
Yep.
Yeah, like in reality, there's no diagnosis. Like you just the labels are a way for us to make sense of the world in a way that doesn't cause us to expend too many calories. Yep. I don't want to think too hard, so I gotta I gotta think in spectrums. Okay, cool. Yeah. So just as an example of That's one, right? And he didn't talk about that in the book.
Okay.
The book is written in this really fun way. He's just telling stories, and I can just feel pieces of my mind falling away. And then I wake up one day and I go to have a conversation, and I could tell that I'm looking for the spectrum conversation and realizing it's total BS, and going, oh, I got to have a different conversation now.
Yeah.
So,
that feels so liberating for me as a mental health therapist, because people always come to me and they're like, do I have ADHD? Am I a narcissist? Am I that, and I, the answer is always like, there's no answer, right? Like every time it's like, yeah, sure. You could look at brain scans, maybe. You can look at your personality. Like I can give them things to look at, but they're not capturing the full experience of what it is to be a human. So they're scared they're wrong or bad or different, or they're failing or struggling, and they think that there's this way to not struggle, and they think that by diagnosing themselves and understanding themselves in that way will help them understand their struggle differently and then reduce their struggle.
Mm-hmm. I also think about like if I can be diagnosed, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that has ADHD.
No,
like I'm not crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's validating.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, I want to be diagnosed with something.
Because I can relate.
So now I'm not alone.
Yeah.
And I also, there's a clear solution. Like there's a medication for that. Like now that I know it's wrong, I can be prescribed the medication.
I can do something about it.
Like
yeah.
I can do something about it. It's like, yeah, that's a very limited view. And some people, I think it is helpful for them to start there.
Yeah.
If they're
to start
in
somewhere.
a lot of suffering, and it's like, hey, let's just give you just a tiny bit of relief here. Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're probably gonna have to unlearn that thing you used to relieve yourself in order to actually get you where you want to go. But
it's like when people use substances.
Yeah,
it works till it doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great Band-Aid.
Yeah,
sometimes really fun.
yeah. Sometimes works really well. Sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. Yep. That's so, and it's interesting because it's a form of resourcing, right? Like it's like not the best,
right? Yeah.
But it's like something. It's whatever you're willing to do, right? Like wherever your willingness is. If your willingness is to like diagnose yourself with ADHD and then take a medication for it, and that makes you feel better, like I feel like that's one step. Mm-hmm. But that you have to it really expand your willingness, I would imagine, right? To be more open to a broader experience.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, something like that.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that. I can't give you a definitive yes or no.
Yeah. People seem to be in or out. I don't know what's causing it.
Well, this conversation today has been absolutely awesome. Like I love talking about this stuff, and I love talking about people that love talking about it. And I think that the more people can see conversations about different ideas, right? Like you were talking about, like being homeschooled and like looking toward people that were older or different ideas, right? And sitting in that room with Ken Wilber and sitting with that think tank, right? Mm-hmm. The more you can open yourself up to just experiencing it, right? And being curious about it, and not having to force yourself into a right or wrong or good or bad, or am I doing it right? Or how do I do it? Or like that scientific method of like, we need to have a control and then variables, and we need to figure out like that even just saying that like brings up anxiety, it's just like, so like this like urgency brings up this sense of urgency to like get it right. So I think that the more conversations people have, the better. And I think that it's awesome that you do what you do. Are you full on coaching, or do you take clients now, or?
Yes, I'm open for, there's a couple things I do. I do some executive coaching. Okay. And I also help my partner out. We're
getting her on next.
We do some retreats out of the country.
Okay.
For some psychedelic experiences.
Okay.
And I also help combat vets. We do something called sacred hunting.
Oh, cool.
And are you familiar with Monsell Denton's work?
No.
He runs sacred hunting, and so I help with the military veteran aspect. So we bring in, we have a 3-day 4-day hunting experience.
Wow.
And it involves an inipi, so it's a Lakota sweat lodge.
Okay.
And hunting, and then we have, there's a psilocybin experience.
That's very cool.
Baked into that as well. and I'm not sure I'm supposed to be talking about this on a podcast, but I think we'll be okay. If we made it here, we're okay. So, but we use a lot of the Native American practices in our hunting, and then helping combat vets. Like, sometimes this is the first time they put their finger on a trigger since combat and things like that. And so
talk about embodied experiences.
And so like we're reorganizing how they experience taking a life and things like that. And so
that's incredible. It's deep work.
Yes.
Yeah. Very deep work.
So I'm pretty selective about who I'm working with right now, but if someone falls in those categories, they can definitely reach out. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you coming up, checking out the studio, being here and having this conversation. And I hope you have more.
Thanks. I've had fun today. This is great. Thanks for having me.
Good. I love it. All right. We will see you next time. Thanks. If you're having a mental health emergency, we urge you to dial the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255 or text the crisis text line. Text HOME to 741-741.